I was diagnosed with leukemia in the latter part of 1991, about 11 years ago. My life is organized around my treatments and my illness, which has taken away, I would say, I don't know, maybe 50%, 60% of my life. And so my life is really dominated by the disease. I mean, very often I have to cancel things. And I try to do in the time that's remaining as much as I can. A lot of people, when they get one of these diseases, say nothing about it, you know. For me, I've always talked about it. I feel it makes me feel better. You know, it makes me feel that I'm still, you know, I'm still a social being, and I'm still in the world. I lost my fear of death maybe a long time ago, early in the disease. You worry about dying quickly, and now I don't really care. It's not a big issue for me. The main thing is to be able to continue and survive, and to be able to do so with a reasonable quality of life. I never discuss. Yeah, this is important. I never discuss the future. I don't ask, well, how much time do I have left? Or you know, when do you think I'm going to die? I mean, obviously I'm going to die. Everybody dies, but I don't. It doesn't really enter into the calculation. The most important thing is the day, and to try to get the most out of the day. I think New York is a very special place. There's a quality of impermanence in New York with the constant travel in the city. Here, business and pleasure and residence and crime and history and extermination and flight and arrival. New York, for example, historically is the point of entry into America, but it's never or rarely the point of final resting. People come to New York, passing through, and go somewhere else. So all of that adds up to a city that is, you know, perfect for me to live in this country, where there's so much emphasis on, I think, false emphasis, or you might say ideological emphasis on rootedness and belonging and nationhood and the sense of community, all of which I find, you know, deeply antithetical to what I feel. These two pictures must have been taken maybe a few months after my birth, and I'm with my mother. I remember this period because of my mother's presence, which was very enveloping, very caring. I think a lot of it may have been due to the fact that she had had a child before me who had survived just a few days and died. So I, as you can tell, was able to live a little longer. And so there was a particular pleasure and delight, I think, that she took in me in those years. Ever since I became aware of myself as a sort of independent person, I had a sense of multiple identities. I mean, I was born in Palestine. Both my parents were Palestinian, yet my father was an American citizen. So that was always a very important part of my life, because I inherited an American citizenship from him without ever having been in America. My mother was Palestinian, but she was also half Lebanese. Then we were a Christian family. And when we were living in Egypt, we were unusual in that respect. Say we were Palestinian, American, Christian, living in what was, even in the days of Cairo's cosmopolitan culture, we were peculiar in that we had identities that didn't fit. So in that respect, I was always slightly outside the the mainstream and having different identities that I had to negotiate. I feel that my early life was divided into two parallel streams, both of them called Edward. There were two Edwards. From my earliest days, the first Edward was very much the creature of discipline, of family order, of school training. And so I felt myself really that first Edward was, it didn't really belong to me. He was the creature of all of these contexts. Then there was another Edward, the other one, that you might say the underground or subterranean Edward, which is where I felt my freedom lay. And there, my imagination, my taste, my ability and interest in reading, my great love of music, the world of fantasy, the world of my sense of where I wanted to go, where I was guided by my own instincts and ambitions and desires, was very much there. And the most important thing about that, I always felt that second identity of Edward as resistant, that it was never compelled in the end by the first. Palestine in my childhood was essentially a place of fun, because my schooling was really mostly in Egypt. And we would spend intermittent periods in Palestine in the summers. And of course I felt a connection to everybody there, you know, relatives and my own family history, which I didn't feel in Egypt, where I was, you know, basically a foreigner. And in '48, my family, the rest of my family, you know, my cousins, aunts, uncles, the whole extended family was driven out of Palestine. So I had nobody left. And Palestine was for me, until I would say the late 60s, until the '67 war, was always a matter of sort of humanitarian issues, you know, refugees, human misery, illness, destitution, despair, that had happened to unfortunate people. So that when I used to go around to the refugee places in Cairo, their homes and their clinics and so on with my aunt, I was aware that this was part of a Palestinian tragedy, but I wasn't very clear about the causes and what in fact had happened. And that really only came later when I came to America, and I got some distance from it and I started to read about it. This one must have been taken maybe a couple of years after. I must have been 13 at the time. Rather solemn and repressed young man. And then suddenly, when I was getting, you know, older, and when I was 14 and 13, and went to Victoria College in Cairo, where there was a sense of animosity between us, who were all Arabs or Italians or Jews or Armenians, and the teachers who were all English. And we were made to feel inferior in school. I mean, the subject matter was English, but I felt, I don't know if everybody else did, but I certainly felt that it was a drawback, a liability in my identity that I wasn't English. That the real, you know, idea of place and home was England. The real history was England. And all the studies I did in for example, history and geography were all European. I knew very little about the world in which I was growing up. It wasn't until later that I sort of educated myself to know more about Egypt. You know, I grew up in Palestine and Egypt without thinking too much about it. I mean, I thought that was the place I belonged in. But I always had this American citizenship, you know, which was reflected in my passport. And that's it. I didn't really have much connection with America. But then, when I was kicked out of school, in, I think it was February of 1951, my father got a lot of catalogs to schools, boarding schools in America, and he consulted with some of his friends. And in the end, a school was picked. I got in, I was admitted, and, you know, I came. I mean, to me, it was sort of unknown. I didn't know what I was coming to. And I thought of it with some enthusiasm, because I felt already in Egypt, in that school, I was quite, you know, hemmed in and compromised, and I didn't like it that much, and so it seemed like a nice change, you know. But it wasn't until I actually got here in 1951, in August of 51. We spent a week in New York. My father, my mother, and I spent a week in New York. And we got on the train, and for about 5 hours we went north. We got off at this tiny little station in the northwestern corner of Massachusetts. And we got out, me with my couple of big suitcases. A car met us at the station. We drove about a mile or two to the school. I was put in a room in the dormitory, and then my parents said, well, we have to go back to New York because there's only one train. It was the same train we came on. So they said goodbye to me, and they went back to New York, and I was alone. This is the spring of 1953, and I was on the tennis team. This is Edmund Alexander. And when I went to America, I was told to look him up because he taught it in school. He was a tennis coach and he was an English teacher. But he refused to speak Arabic to me. And then he said, no, 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 brother, I don't speak Arabic. This is America. We left the Arab world behind. Now we're Americans and we speak English. My sense of exile really has been lifelong. I mean, I always felt myself to be out of place. It's a question of articulating it and realizing that your position, or the feeling you have of, let's say, of marginality, or of not being able quite to belong or identify with a collective group, that took a while for me to be able to articulate. But the sense of exile I had really ever since I was a kid, and the fact of multiple histories and multiple languages and so on and so forth, as I say, can be a source of I wouldn't call it enjoyment exactly, but it can be a source of discovery and seeing things that people who have been in the same place all the time and can see with only one, as it were, perspective, don't have. The idea behind my book on Orientalism is to seek out the origins and the coherence of descriptions of the Orient that began to appear in Europe in the end of the 18th, early 19th century, that were different from the descriptions of the Orient that had appeared before. Orientalism is really about the manufacture of the other, and that other is really of great convenience to oneself, and it can only be done it is mainly done for purposes of domination, and that knowledge and domination in the imperial context almost always go together. I even argue that the representations of the Orient sometimes insinuate themselves into the minds of Indians and Egyptians and Persians and later Africans and others. That is to say that they become part of the system by acquiescing in this system. But it isn't really until after the empire becomes a kind of business or a kind of going system that the system of Orientalism becomes, is in place. When we're talking about things like Orientalism and imperialism and the idea of culture itself, we're really talking about historical and not divine areas. And that one has to be able to study them as a result of human effort, of human labor, and the result of human will also. So out of that comes a lot of other things. Also comes, for example, the contest over history, the struggle. Who owns history? Who has the right to say this is the past and this isn't? How do certain things get effaced from memory? What is the official past? What is the unofficial past? What is suppressed? What is recalled? Why? When? And so on and so forth. You know, the question of differences, of human difference, really, and whether that notion of difference can extend to very large collectivities, such as West and East, or Orient and Occident, is something about which I'm very doubtful. They're historical differences, let's say, rather than genetic and metaphysical differences, which is what is often meant. You know, there's a kind of sense of Western values and all that stuff. I mean, that, to me, that's basically demagoguery. I mean, because if you deconstruct those, you'll see that, you know, they're common to everyone. I mean, there's nobody, for example, who doesn't believe in the idea of human freedom, or human dignity, or compassion, or human fraternity, or love, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, all of them. But so it's a much more complex thing than saying East versus West. That's what I'm trying to say. I mean, there is belligerency and there is aggression, but it's not genetic. I think it's manufactured. It's a political reflex developed for other reasons, whether resources, oil, for example, or geostrategic ideas about who should control what area for what reason. To me, it's much more interesting and impressive how cultures, you know, constantly feed each other across what are supposed to be lines of demarcation. And to me are, in fact, lines of coexistence and complementarity and counterpoint, which is the word I use from you know, music. I mean, in other words, I think it's a kind of horizontal thing rather than these vertical entities which face each other across chasm. My question is can you, it's really the core question of Orientalism. Do these designations of East and West, of Oriental and Occidental, the types, the nationalities, if they are taken, you know, to the degree that they have been taken, you know, not just as a loose designation saying, oh, well, he's French, he can't possibly understand Chinese. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the profound study of the other as very other, and studying the circumstances of how this kind of knowledge grew and how it's associated with empire. So my real question was, can we maintain that kind of knowledge and at the same time maintain humanism? Isn't there something profoundly anti-humanist about knowledge that's based on difference and the inferiority and submission of the other and the alienation of the other? And my question was, maybe not. Maybe we can't be the two together. And it's a question that has still bothered me. And I've, you know, even now, 25 years later, I'm working on trying to define the relationship between humanism and knowledge. And to see knowledge not as a kind of fixed, frozen, I mean, the equivalent of a row of books like that, which sit quietly, you know, the way Borges saw the library, sort of a threatening, formidable presence, but rather as something constantly in motion, constantly being added to, dynamic, where you and the other are always in dialogue, based on comprehension, on common ideas about humanity, you know, about human history, about human ambition, about human, above all, human freedom. If you're an Arab or a Palestinian in this country, since I've been here, you feel really as if you're on the wrong side. I'll give you a very graphic example. In 1967, I was a young assistant professor at Columbia at the time of the war. I would come out of the subway and walk to where I lived in the Columbia area at the time. And very often I would see people with little transistor radios in their ear, standing in the doorway or on the street listening to the news of the war. And very often I would hear people saying, "How are we doing?" And, you know, people responding, "Oh, we're doing great." And they were Americans, but they were so completely identified with Israel and the victories of Israel that I felt, you know, as an Arab, you know, sort of not only embarrassed, but I wish I could disappear. It was a perfect moment to sort of deny who you were. And as I became more politically active, it was also much more difficult for me because I was then sort of openly identified, not just with the losing side, but with the discredited side. The narrative in the popular mind, which of course the media carried and reinforced all the time, was basically that, you know, that Israel and the Jews were kind of democratic and plucky and pioneering and white people who were like us, whereas the Arabs were, you know, fanatical and violent and so on. And so the whole idea of trying to give, quote unquote, the other side is very, very difficult. And you always feel that you're guilty trying to prove your innocence, kind of thing. I began to be involved in Palestinian politics, I would say, almost immediately after the '67 war, because here was a, you know, patently a colonial situation. And then I was a member of the Palestine National Council. I became a member in 1977. The main players, really, in the Arab-Israeli conflict have always been, in my opinion, the Palestinians and the Israelis. That is to say, the native inhabitants of Palestine, and that's what attaches me to the cause, really, because I think it was a tremendous injustice to simply dispossess and remove and cleanse ethnically a people. The core of the issue is the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. And in both cases, Palestinian and Israeli, there was an important extension, which is the diaspora, which makes the Palestinian-Israeli conflict different, let's say, from the conflict in South Africa, which is essentially about the people there. In this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, there's always been a diaspora, an extension. And these populations have played a very important role as sources, in the case of the Jewish diaspora, as sources of immigration to Israel, as well as sources of support. The refugee population of the Palestinians has been very important because it's there where the Palestinian movement began, the new Palestinian movement of the PLO. The PLO is made up of expatriate Palestinians, and Arafat, when he took over the PLO in 1968, had spent most of his life in Kuwait, not in Palestine. And these diasporas have played a very important part in the conflict, in shaping it, in giving it a kind of wider scope, particularly when it comes to information, propaganda, culture, all those things that make a struggle over land a much bigger thing than just a struggle over land.
Egypt, now France? Yes. Iran? No. Iraq? No. The United States? Yes.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Of course, in a struggle between Palestinians and Israelis, the perceptions they have of each other are terribly important. So the perceptions of the Israelis of Palestinians and vice versa, I think, are now kind of pretty much exclusive. That is to say, they exclude the other. Israeli history for Palestinians is, generally speaking, only the history of the oppression of Palestinians. And so there's a narrative been constructed, you know, in the popular mind that Israel really destroyed our lives. It's still very difficult for most Arabs to accept the idea that the Jews of Israel come from, in many cases, not in every case, but I mean as a people, that they come from a history of suffering and persecution and genocide and so on. On the other side, it's the same. You know, most Israelis regard Palestinians as inferior, as sort of niggers, you know, that they are the sort of black people, the wogs, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the narrative is all about, I mean, even the word, I mean, 1948, which is for us the Nakba, for Israelis is the War of Independence. So, but when you ask independence from whom? They say, no, we won our state. Yeah, but at the expense of what? So you've got to be able to try to make the connection. That's the thing. Say, yes, you won independence, but at the price of it was the destruction of Palestinian society. It's very difficult to do that. And it's very, very difficult to introduce another kind of dynamic. I mean, one of the things that I've been very interested in, intellectually, and even politically, is to try to, both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, to try to make the narrative more complicated. It's not a simple line of, you know, at the end, and you're exterminated. But that there are many kinds of ways in which Palestinian and Israeli or Jewish history intersect and depend on each other. And that's an interesting kind of history to write. And that's why I think intellectuals in the diaspora can play an important role, you know, in demystification and trying to tell another story. I don't like the words dialogue and peace because they have been used, they've been debased so much by the, I mean, if one wants to talk about dialogue and peace, well, I think one should talk about things like independence, self-determination, and coexistence. So it's not dialogue and peace. I think what we need are movements for coexistence and equality. And of course, in Palestine it exists, because we wouldn't have been able to survive even through this terrible period of the Second Intifada without the commitment of men and women who ran the hospitals, who ran the health services, who run the schools. In other words, we have the infrastructure, which Sharon was unable to destroy, of a civil society in Palestine. And that element is going to provide the leadership for the next phase of our struggle. It's principally a cultural and political leadership rather than a military leadership, which was the old model for the PLO. I think that's the only hope. But the old armed struggle model of Fatah and the PLO, which played a very important role, you know, for a long time, is I think now gone. It's outmoded. And the same is true in Israel. The army used to be the core of Israeli society. Well, the army has brought discredit to its name. You know, it's now indulging in war crimes and the abuse of civilians. So it can't, whatever leadership for the future comes, it can't be from there. I mean, and leadership means peace in this sense.
The Arab states cannot tolerate this break in their unity and this menace to their political and economic life.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי, בה עוצבה דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית.
بيهددوا بالحرب اليهود. بنقول لهم أهلا وسهلا، إحنا مستعدين للحرب.
Hoi, hoi, even op de zet.
حق كل فلسطيني أن يعود إلى وطنه. هذا حق أقرته الشرائع، أقرته قوانين الشارتر في الأمم المتحدة يقول هذا الكلام.
So I have no contact with Arafat. I stopped talking to him in 1992. I resigned from the National Council, and I was the first one really to write against him and his decisions. I mean, I just felt that he had made too many mistakes and that he had overstayed. And I felt the biggest mistake he made was Oslo. Not that he signed it, but that he didn't consult with his people. He should have said, this is at our moment now, this is the deal that we got. And if you were for it, then I will go forward. If not, I will resign. He never offered his people a choice. He never communicates with his people, which I think is a crime. And then, of course, during the 90s, as Oslo unfolded, and Oslo had said nothing about settlements, Oslo said nothing about the end of occupation, Oslo said nothing about sovereignty, Oslo said nothing about water, since most of the water for Israel comes from the West Bank. The aquifers are underneath Palestinian territory. It became clear to me that what we were watching was the transformation of the West Bank and Gaza into part of Greater Israel. And that's where I conceived the idea that, you know, that a separate Palestinian state was a geographical impossibility. A binational state, in the end, is the only solution to having people who are so mixed in history and proximity and interests, right? That it would come about through peaceful and you know, democratic means rather than through war. I don't see that war can accomplish anything. It hasn't so far. I mean, I don't have a practical, you know, a practical way of implementing it because I'm not a politician. But I think there would have to be stages. In the first place, there would have to be an admission, both by Palestinians, or recognition, both by Palestinians and by Israelis, that there's no hope of getting rid of the other. They're two peoples in one land, at present, mixed but unequal. That is to say, the Israelis dominate Palestinian life to a fantastic degree. Take the case of the Palestinians inside Israel. They are Israeli citizens, but they don't have the same rights as Israeli Jews. They don't have the right of immigration. They don't have the right to own and lease and sell land, which only Jews can do in Israel. And they're not protected by a Bill of Rights or a constitution. That would have to take place. And there is a movement in Israel, you know, for a constitution and for a Bill of Rights, and a similar one inside Palestine. So those are, you know, some of the ways. I would say the peaceful ways in which this would come about, and that's why I've always felt that from our point of view as Palestinians, and I want to just concentrate on that, I feel that a major part of my work, for example, as somebody who lives and works abroad, is to formulate a discourse and a vision that would include Israelis. And that's why I've always been opposed to terrorism and suicide bombing and all that other stuff, because it alienates the population, precisely the people whom you need to bring about a better state for your people. Look, I think that the question of Palestine is really the last remaining inter-Arab issue which has any kind of emotional and political power within Arab society as a whole. I mean, if there's a really strong public sympathy, as I think there is, it's not shared by the regimes and the Arab state system. I think for completely understandable reasons. In other words, I think the state system has understood the challenge of the Palestinians, you see, always. That it's not a challenge about land only, but it's a major social and political challenge to the existing Arab order. Because basically we're a movement for democracy and equality, for human rights, for freedom of expression, which is something that I've been very engaged in, and for, the idea of citizenship in Arabic, al-muwatana, which is very, that's a Palestinian core concern. And of course the Arab state system has no interest in any of those things. We're dealing with very old regimes, that some of them have been in existence for 30 or 40 years, repressive regimes, very anti-democratic, very socially retarded, that have produced one of the worst collective results in the contemporary world. So I think the importance of Palestine, in my opinion, is that it's a challenge, or you might say a provocation, on many levels of civil society, and is perceived correctly as a threat to the existing order. As a Palestinian intellectual, it would seem to me that one of the things that are terribly important is for the Palestinian intellectual to keep the question of Palestine alive, which means going against prevailing policy not only in America and Europe, but even in the Arab world and even in Palestine. You see, I mean, because there's a consensus around certain views that need to be challenged. Where, in other words, the role of that intellectual is to ask questions, to disturb people, to stir up reflection, to provoke, you might say, controversy and thought. Finally, the point to be made is that the role of the intellectual is never to justify power, never, always to be critical of power. Whether it's the power of the weak or the power of the strong, power is power. Of course, there are different kinds of power, but in a relative situation, the role of the intellectual is to challenge power by providing, as I said, alternative models, and also, as important, resources of hope. I mean, the intellectual has to provide a perspective. It's not our destiny to be refugees. It's not our destiny to be prisoners of war. It's not our destiny to be, commandos. It's not our destiny to be an army of occupation. We have a choice. And so you have to be able to, to point that out. Finally, I think I don't want to be misunderstood as saying that the job of the intellectual is to preach or, to be a kind of sermonizer, but rather to be engaged, and that, the affiliations, the relationships between the intellectual's work, whether it's writing or speaking or organizing or agitating, any of those things, really cannot be done individually. It has to be done as part of a social movement. But the social movement itself needs criticism too, and opposition. You know, it's never completely 100% right. And the Palestinian is a perfect example of that, you know. It's really quite shocking to me how, during the Intifada of the last 2 years, in New York, I feel very much a marked man because I'm Palestinian. The style of discourse is so geared, not just to the media, but to television. And television is based upon the soundbite, short phrases. So if you get an interview, I did an interview shortly after 9/11, and that was the last interview I did on American television. If you get a long interview, you might get 3 minutes. That's long on the national news. And basically the questions they asked are, do you denounce terrorism? Or why are Palestinian children taught to hate Jews? That's the quality. So of course you're immediately guilty, and you have less than a minute to try to prove that you're not guilty and that in fact something else is happening. So there's a battle for space. So I don't do these interviews anymore. I said, well, it's simply not worth my effort to spend time debating a foolish person on television who's asking me stupid questions that, you know, that the media has invented. Daniel, I'd heard in concerts and recitals over the years and had been, you know, tremendously attracted to that, being myself a kind of failed musician. And Daniel, as you could probably tell, doesn't really represent the official line. I think we both felt a kind of openness. And then, you know, I think the musical part was very important.
Well, music has become something that has served as essentially a kind of metaphor for political or social bridges for the two of you. You collaborated on this East-West Divan, which began in Weimar. Maybe you could just explain for people what this is and what the idea behind it was. Daniel came up with this idea of perhaps why not have it as a kind of a workshop for young musicians from the Arab countries and from Israel. And the idea was to bring these kids together through a series of auditions and actually travels in the Middle East. It was a very complex thing to set up. And then they came together in Weimar. And I watched this extraordinary thing of bringing together a disparate bunch of about 70 or 80. Isn't that right? About 70, 80? The youngest of whom was maybe 15, and the oldest was in the middle 20. We should open it up to questions, but before that, I want to ask just one very specific political question. You've played in Ramallah recently, and can I take it as a given that that by doing this, you share the hopes of many Israelis and Palestinians for two states?
I don't believe that there is a military solution to the conflict in the Middle East. If there was a military solution, maybe one could look at it differently. From Israel's point of view, I don't think there is a military solution because Israel has developed a very strong army, has had to develop a very strong army. But the Intifada has shown that the Palestinians, whether every Israeli likes it or not, is fighting for his own identity. And the only security for Israel is its acceptance by its neighbors, the Palestinians in particular, and the Arabs in general.
When in the act of teaching and pulling out the music, pulling out their thoughts on the music, were you doing a specifically Jewish type of education? And did you know that you were doing a politically Jewish type of education at the time that you were doing it?
it's not a question of giving Jewish values or Jewish education. The fact that there are certain values that are associated with Jewish history is a wonderful thing. Like there are certain values that are associated with others. But the minute I was in front of the young people, I was totally disinterested in whether they came from Damascus or they came from Tel Aviv. I think that you could say that this is a very Jewish way of looking at things. That you are in the Cheder and you detach yourself from the outside world.
Well, I don't really subscribe to that. I think to think in terms of sort of assigning to peoples, people with a capital P, certain values and certain characteristics that are uniquely theirs is the beginning of the end, in my opinion. I think it's a terrible idea. I think universal values are universal values. If you wanted to look, if you wanted to look for ethics and generosity and intellect and prizing those and all that, you can find them in any culture, actually, And I think the point is to find them in every culture and not to say, well, I mean, that's where Germany, as it were, went down the hill, the slope in the 20s and the 30s, this idea that there's a special German mission, or there's a special Italian this, that, and the other thing, or there's a special Jewish this, that, and the other, there's a special Arab. I think that's the death of humanity. I think one should be able to think outside those. I mean, God knows that education teaches you that your heritage and your history and your people and your language are the best. We all are educated in that. You don't grow up going to school to find out that your people and your traditions and so on were really debased from the beginning and have remained debased. No, that's not what you study. You study of how great we are. And so in the natural course of things, you're going to learn that anyway. But I think the better part of education is to sort of unlearn all of that and try to see it in a much larger context. Talking of love of country, love of place, is a vocabulary that I just find completely mysterious. It doesn't resonate with me. I don't feel that kind of attachment, that kind of belonging. Largely because I see the world in terms of people cut off and moving, migration, immigration. So, I think it's just a different vision of the world. And for me, the vision of the world where one is permanently cut off from, and even in the end finally disbelieves in the place as a place to which one can return, which one can think about with a great deal of nostalgia and love and positive feeling, that just doesn't exist for me. My interest in Palestine, for instance, is an interest in a place which is precisely unrecoverable and is the kind of the place of exile from the origin. One is always going away from Palestine rather than coming to it. And for me, it's a notion of striving, it's a notion of looking for justice, trying not exactly to repair, but trying to alleviate suffering, rather than make it into the kind of paradise where everybody can go back to their orchards or their beautiful farms or their lovely houses and so on. That to me is an inauthentic kind of thing. And I don't believe in the notion of a kind of final coming home. I mean, there's a wonderful line in a poem by Whitman in which he said, "I contain multitudes." I think it's, I mean, of course, it's a kind of oceanic feeling of complexity and diversity, and obviously a great deal of arrogance and egoistic assertion. But I think it's true that we are all many selves. And the fascination of literature, the fascination of the fantastic, the fascination of the imagination has to do with that multiplicity. And there's so much in our contemporary life which is all about consolidation of identity, of fixing things, of tying them down, of wanting to make identity the core of everything, but a monolithic identity. It seems to me that the other option, which is the one I've been discussing, is a much more positive and liberating one, even though you may never accomplish it. So in the end, you ask yourself the question, is it important? And perhaps this is the exile's question at the end of his life. Is it important to have a place? Or maybe it's better not to have actually gotten one. There may be more to being out of place than being in place, And maybe because if you don't know a place in that sense, if you don't feel that you belong in a place and it's yours, you don't really have the experience of owning and dominating and affirming and consolidating, as in the case of identity. And if you think of your identity as much more diverse and intertwined with others, with other identities, if you like, then I think the whole notion of unity and coherence, is diminished, which is okay. I mean, I don't mind that. I think that's better than let's say fundamentalism, which says, no, this is it. And if you don't believe it, and if you're not like that, then you're the enemy. This was taken by a professional photographer, and it shows a rather grim, serious-looking gentleman of uncertain age. You see, my white hair hadn't quite begun. It was before, I knew I had leukemia, but I hadn't had any treatment, and I was I think it's a rather drawn picture, with some anguish and a great deal of uncertainty. Plus this rather severe outlook on being an intellectual in opposition.